entitled Mom Ends Up in Court. Okay, first off, I am a model railroader. Specifically, I model an O-scale. For reference, that means that the average locomotive is about 3 to 4 inches tall and up to a foot long. Depending on type, that is. One summer, I was taking part in a model railroad fair at our local mall, where I was displaying some of my models. Being that I'm from the US, the fact that I modeled the British Isles, GWR for you Brit readers, meant that my display really stood out. Now, as there's always kids at these types of shows, I had taken to putting a plexiglass side around my layout to prevent children from reaching in and touching things or damaging various parts of the structures and models that went with the railroad. While I was watching one locomotive I had just received leave the staging area, it's a small 3-track system that lets me funnel trains into the layout and then out as needed. I remembered this one lady making comments about the cute little trains. Getting that train running at a nice but slow pace, I approached her and smiled, asking if there's any questions she had. The lady never missed a beat, pointing to the train I had just started and told me that her son liked trains and I should sell her one for him. Now, truth be known, this wasn't an uncommon thing to have happen. People, usually other modelers, may ask if some units are up for sale. Sometimes they are, but typically not. I explained to her that the locomotive wasn't for sale and that even if it was, she wouldn't have liked the price anyway, noting that the engine she was pointing to had cost me close to $1,000. The lady was having none of it and offered me $10 for it since it was obviously a toy. I ignored her and went back to getting the next train set up on the staging track, waiting for that one to return. As I do this, I hear an odd sound and look up just in time to see the lady picking the locomotive up off the track and moving to hand it to her kid. I called out for her to stop, which may have been a mistake, as she promptly dropped it on the ground. The engine, though somewhat robust and heavy, was made of rather soft brass. When it hit the ground, there was a sickening crunch. I knew from the sound that the engine was done for. Broken beyond repair. The lady just looked down at it, shrugged, and kicked it back under the table before starting to walk off. Thankfully, security quickly caught up with her and detained her while police were called. All the while she kept saying it's just a toy, men don't play with toys, while ignoring the fact she was surrounded by dozens of train layouts with just as many grown men showing off their work. Police arrested her on destruction of private property charges, while the mall itself barred her from ever setting foot on their property again. Later, with her information on hand from the police report, I filed a case against her for the replacement of the locomotive. You won't believe it, but she had the gall to try to convince the judge that it was just a toy and the receipts I had for purchase of the locomotive weren't real. Saying that she had seen the exact same locomotive at Walmart herself. Well, the case ended up in my favor, with her having to pay me replacement costs, as well as some punitive damages. The judge ended the case with the simple warning that just because you want something doesn't give you the right to simply take it. From the criminal side of things, I think the lady ended up with 40 or so hours of community service and a substantial fine as well. Here's hoping she learned her lesson. You're getting married? But what about my cruise? I debated posting this story because I know some of my family is on Reddit, but I just decided that if they see this, I'm not going to care. The woman in this story did some crazy shit recently, but it doesn't really fit this sub, so I guess that's a story for another time. Telling this story is a good way to vent off some of the steam, I guess. Cast, GC, good cousin GH, good husband, GC's husband, EC, entitled cousin, GC's twin sister, you can call her evil cousin too, both work. So this story doesn't involve me too much, but I know quite a lot about EC's actions and behavior through stories family members and GC told me. Ever since we were little kids, my cousin, GC, and I have been best buds. We lived only a few miles away from one another, so we would bike to each other's houses, play in our backyards, and play video games. GC comes from an extremely wealthy family. Her dad, my uncle, started a business when he was 20, and it has been super successful to the point there are now several large locations across the globe. Even though this family is crazy rich, they live a very modest lifestyle. They live in a small 2-story home on a few acres of land, and a large pond takes up most of it. The one lavish thing they do is that every 2 or 3 years, they go on a cruise. GC is one of 3 children. She has an older brother and her identical twin sister, EC. You may think the good twin, evil twin scenario is only seen on the TV screen, but GC and EC are the real-world equivalent. GC is kind and generous while EC selfish and entitled. EC always had this idea in her head that, because her dad was so wealthy, she didn't have to lift a finger in life to get what she wanted. Good things just came to her, GC, and their brother, but GC had the common sense to know that she can't always rely on daddy's money. Despite getting pretty much everything they wanted growing up, GC and her brother never had entitled attitudes. Their parents are also super nice, so EC was always the evil standout of the family. EC's attitude only got worse as time went on. Eventually, EC got married and had a kid, a boy. EC's husband is just as nasty as she is, so they were kind of made for each other. EC always wanted to rub her child in GC's face like she wanted gloat about having a kid before she did. GC had a history of bad relationships, including those that involved verbal and physical abuse. One time, she came to her sister for advice after her boyfriend beat her. EC had the nerve to blame her weight and not using makeup to make herself more attractive. GC was afraid to date anyone after her last relationship disaster, but that changed when she finally met the man of her dreams, GH. I met GH personally, and he's a giant teddy bear of a guy. He's the perfect guy to help heal GC's old wounds and give her the loving, happy life she deserves. Then, nearly 2 years after they met, GC and GH were engaged. The entire family was thrilled that GC finally got the man of her dreams, and her father wanted to throw a boatload of money to her to help pay for a beautiful wedding. For future reference, he did the same thing for EC when she got married, yet EC was not happy about how extravagant GC's wedding was going to be. GC wanted to be married at Niagara Falls and invite basically everyone she knew, and her father was going to pay for pretty much all of it. EC was furious. She talked to GC and their father about the wedding and how all the money being spent better not interfere with the family's upcoming cruise. Yes, they still went on cruises together every few years despite the children being grown and having families of their own. Their father said that, because of the wedding and how expensive it was going to be, the family cruise would have to be pushed back another year or two. EC practically exploded. She blamed GC for taking the cruise away from her and her precious boy, who was 5 at this point. She said she told her son how they were going on a cruise and how now he's going to be so upset now because his selfish aunt wanted to get married instead of giving him a happy week in the tropics. EC even had the audacity to demand GC to reschedule the wedding for next year so they could go on the cruise instead. GC, who is normally not a confrontational person, had it with her sister's attitude and told her if she wanted to go on a cruise, she would have to pay for it herself. EC and her husband were nowhere near as wealthy as their father, and there was no way he was going to reschedule his own daughter's wedding just to give EC what she wanted. EC's ranting went on for weeks, flipping back and forth between blaming her sister for ruining her son's year and begging her father for money to go on a cruise because she and her family deserved it. She drove GC to tears and she ended up calling me up for advice. My only advice to her was to give EC, who normally gets everything, nothing, and by nothing, I mean don't invite her to the wedding. Like most sisters would do, GC wanted EC to be one of her bridesmaids as she was a bridesmaid at EC's wedding. Not inviting her would be a major upset for everyone involved, but it just may be the thing to teach EC a lesson. So she did just that. GC called up her sister and flat out told her that if she didn't change her attitude, she didn't want it leaving a sour taste at her wedding. Again, EC blew up shouting at GC, calling her all sorts of names, and again blaming her for the cruise being cancelled. GC hung up and decided to not invite her to the wedding. The wedding was amazing, and I ended up being the bridesmaid to take EC's place. Yes, I was invited to the wedding originally, but GC didn't want me to be a bridesmaid only because she knew I hated dresses and I'd rather wear a suit, but I said I'd wear a dress just for her special day. It's been a few years now, and GC and GH have a beautiful little girl and have a baby boy on the way. EC is still in their lives and is still nasty as ever, but she doesn't come to her father begging for anything anymore because after her behavior towards him and GC, he threatened to leave her out of his will if she continued to pester either of them. Maybe now that she's not going to get everything handed to her on a silver platter, she'll change her attitude for the better, or at least that's what we all wish to happen. God have mercy.